So Doc Holliday makes his way to Dodge City, having left behind his troubled life in West Texas, and it looks like he's starting again, maybe, because he started over a couple of times, and now he's going to be in Dodge City, where at the very least he follows Wyatt there. Wyatt's already gone up, Doc is there, or Wyatt arrives a little after. Anyway, they both end up in Dodge City, and he takes a room at Deacon Cox's boarding house. What's interesting about Deacon Cox to this story?
Well, Deacon Cox is another Georgian. He keeps running into these folks from Georgia. And apparently, they got along well enough that he took patients at the hotel.
Right.
His office was in the hotel.
Which was very typical of his time, because it didn't take nearly the kind of equipment it does now. And they called them itinerant dentists, and they would travel with a portable headrest they could actually put on the back of a chair. So you had all of your dental equipment in a bag. You didn't have to have a big dental chair, although there is a dental chair that's out there on the antiques market that claims to be Doc Holliday's dental chair from Dodge City. Yeah. And
there are a couple of chairs that are. There's a guy in Florida who has bought a dental chair.
Dr. Richie Thomas.
Yeah.
And yes, wonderful exhibit of Doc Holliday dental equipment there.
And the other one was in the museum in Nebraska for a while. That's the one that supposedly had the Dodge City address on it.
Exactly, and supposedly the box it came in, it said that it had been shipped by Dr. Seeger, his Dallas partner, all the way up there. And I kind of question that. I don't know that he and Dr. Seeger were on such sweet terms that it would have been saved, but it takes a lot of knowledge to fabricate something like that too. So that's interesting. But we know for sure that he practiced, because there was an ad in the local paper. And I love this. It said that where satisfaction is not given, money will be returned. Yeah. And people laugh when I tell them that. They say, "Oh yeah," they show me their imaginary pistol. "Yeah, I'll give you my money back, I'll give you your money back over the point of my pistol here." But my husband's a dentist, and we try really hard not to kill our patients. So I think Doc was not out to kill his patients. And Bat Masterson actually said he didn't get into any trouble in Dodge City.
Well, that's the interesting thing, is that his sojourn in Dodge City, which wasn't that long, was one without any recorded trouble. And it had no incident. There are no incidents connected to it.
And isn't that interesting that he's met Wyatt, and his life has taken a turn now? He's got maybe somebody whose opinion he cares about, and he's going to behave better, or maybe having friends again makes a difference for him. He has somebody else with him, though.
There's Kate.
There's Kate with him. But as far as we know, Kate didn't get into any trouble in Dodge either.
No, she. I think it must have been an interesting thing for her to go back to where she had. She was a known commodity at one time, and some of the old timers doubtlessly remembered her
very fondly. Perhaps some of them.
Some of them. And because Kate made the claim that it can be disproven that she and Doc were together at Cantonment Sweetwater when Bat Masterson kills Corporal King.
Which is kind of stretching it with the time there.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like Doc could have been there when
No, I don't
Bat
think he was there.
Kate might have been, but not Doc.
You've got Kate on that string from Wichita to Dodge City down to Cantonment Sweetwater and points left. She was what was the other gambler's name that she was running with? But Tom Sherman is the constant.
Right.
But there's no indication that he had anything to do. But the route between Dodge City and Sweetwater was just a wagon road that had.
Right. So it's reasonable to think she was there and she knew some of those things. She did like to drop Doc into the story at places where she was, and but they are there together in Dodge City. Neither one of them gets into trouble that we know of, but Wyatt almost gets into some bad trouble, and he says this incident is why he and Doc Holliday are friends, or why he's loyal to Doc. And it was actually something that Wyatt said in court testimony. So this didn't come from Stuart Lake. This didn't come from anything else. This was Wyatt in court testimony. You want to talk about that, the event with the Desperados?
Yes, well, actually, this took place in September of 1878, and it was a really a rowdy time. Most of the cattlemen, a lot of the cattlemen were still there, and this was also when the Cheyennes were going north, that left the reservation in the Indian Territory and were planning to go back home to Montana.
And there were some massacres along the way.
And there were some incidents and more rumors than you could count about what was going on. But one of the people that was involved was a man named Toby Driscoll, and his outfit is likely the group that Wyatt had an encounter with. But the story is that Wyatt was that a group of cowboys were making were causing a disturbance on the street, and that Wyatt approached them. And when he approached them, he was suddenly surrounded by them, and the cowboys were just basically had him pinned in, and Doc Holliday was playing cards in the Long Branch, I believe it was, and with Frank Loving, and he asked Frank if he had a pistol, and Frank,
which means Holliday didn't.
Well, it could, or maybe he's got backup. I don't know, one or the other. But it's possible. So Doc then took the pistol that Frank Loving gave him and walked out onto the sidewalk and approached them from a different angle, and this intimidated the cowboys, and they what could have been a bloody shootout ended up being he arrested the offenders. Wyatt did, but Wyatt said more than once in his lifetime that he and Doc Holliday were friends after that.
Yeah,
he saved my life.
Exactly. He said in that court testimony, I am a friend of Doc Holliday's because one time when I was in Dodge City and was surrounded by desperados, he saved my life.
Yes.
So, people, the movies say, why is he a friend of Holliday's? Because Doc makes him laugh. No, Doc saved his life.
Doc saved his life.
So whatever Doc's failings might have been character-wise, he'd saved Wyatt's life, and Wyatt was loyal to that.
There's some small things that happened when he was in Dodge City that don't show up in most accounts. Where he was, there was a man named George Bowles who wrote a book about his time in Dodge City, and he's asked about, he was talking about Doc Holliday, and he said he was quiet and didn't say much and didn't have but he seemed like a nice enough fellow or something.
And you hear that often in descriptions of Doc, that he was well dressed, that he was well mannered, and that he, unless somebody roused him to violence, he was quiet. He was self-effacing.
Yeah.
So that was pretty bold of him to come out and save Wyatt's life. Now he doesn't last long in Dodge City because the cattle drive is gone, and Dodge in the fall gets really, really quiet, which is one of the reasons Wyatt had left before to go make some money elsewhere. And so Holliday goes over to Trinidad, Colorado, takes the train, which now goes there, takes the train to Trinidad, and he is in company with Kate, and she tells a story about his getting involved in another gambling incident in Trinidad.
Well, there's a story that it actually shows up several places. Kate tells it, and even Wyatt refers to it in the late papers. There's a reference to it, and we got into another fight with an individual known as Kid Colton
In another gambling hall.
in another gambling hall.
Yeah.
And but it's not a fatal incident apparently, but it's probably that incident that decided, that enabled them to move on again.
Well, and Judge Mabry, who was a judge there in Trinidad for years, and he's passed away a long time since, but he swears that as a young law clerk, he saw the paperwork for the charge for that, and then he never could find it again. So,
well, that was a problem. It still is a problem. There was they discovered what went missing years ago was the arrest records for Dodge City.
Wow.
In 1878. The only thing we had were notes that Walter Campbell, also known as Stanley Vestal, made when he went through them. And it was interesting. A few years ago, an article appeared that in True West magazine. It said that they had just found this important document had been found and it was the book of arrest records for 1878.
And these things just walk off with people, and they
he
keep them
thought,
as souvenirs.
in fact, they said that it had been in the attic of this family for
Right.
years. Well, when they turned it, I wrote Bob Bell about it, and I said, Bob, I want to tell you that these records were not in somebody's house 75 years ago, because they were examined by Stanley Vestal in the 1950s, before he wrote his book on Dodge City, and said we've known that such a thing existed, but it doesn't have a long history.
It's so frustrating. I wish it could all be in just one central museum somewhere. Everybody contribute all of these wonderful things you've got, and then we all have them, but there's so much history that we don't know because it's scattered into people's personal belongings all over.
And in fact, the FBI investigated that. And
because it's arrest records.
Eventually it was, instead of being sold at an auction like they were planning to do, they returned the book to
good choice.
to Dodge City.
Good choice. So the same thing happens with Doc's perhaps arrest record there in Trinidad. So another good time to get out of town. But Kate tells the story, and this is all from her, and this is an interesting story that we've been able to really substantiate. She tells about how he takes very sick in Trinidad.
Yeah,
and remember, he's been in Dodge City for that summer, and Dodge is a horrible, dusty town. And so he's been breathing in all of that stuff, and for a man with any kind of a lung ailment, that would be difficult. So now he's in Trinidad, and he takes sick again. And she has to take him down to it's told that she needs to take him to the hot springs resort down in New Mexico, and it was the Montezuma Hot Springs that had been famous even with the Indians there.
Yeah.
And then during the war, the Army used it as a hot springs, a mineral springs for their soldiers to recuperate. So it's already a famous thing, and it's up the canyon from the town of Las Vegas, New Mexico. And she takes him on this harrowing stagecoach ride, or not stagecoach, a wagon ride.
Wagon ride.
Sorry, over the Raton Pass. And they talk about how it's so steep that they have to tie the wagon down to these huge iron rings that are in the mountainside.
In the mountains to keep it from falling off.
Yeah, and it's snowing and it's freezing, and she takes him over this ride. And one of the teamsters on that drive later wrote about it and said that there was a woman, and he thought she was Germanic of some kind. She had an accent, he said, and the man who was with her was in very bad shape. And so they get down to Fort Union, and then from there go on into Las Vegas, New Mexico. Kate saves the day at that point, and now Holliday owes her his life. So there's a lot of loyalties that go on because somebody saved somebody else. So they end up in the town of Las Vegas, New Mexico. He goes up into the canyon, is healed there at the Mineral Springs. There's a hotel just opening. He likely stayed at the new Hot Springs Hotel, which is still there. It's on the campus there of a college now, and people can visit that 19th century hotel there. And he sets up in business, 2 businesses in Las Vegas. Want to talk about his 2 businesses?
Well, I think it's the last place that he practices dentistry.
Yeah, as far as we know.
As far as we know.
In Old Town, because Las Vegas.
That's in Old Town. And then he has opens a saloon in partnership with Jordan Webb on Center Street.
in what they call Newtown, because
In Newtown,
yeah, because
what
Las
was-
Vegas is on the river, and
Yeah.
then when the railroad came, that's just over the river.
Yeah,
So that's
it's
Newtown.
Newtown was the center for most of the high life of it's like most of those railroad towns. Would be one side of the tracks would be rougher than the other.
Right, well, it's definitely the rough side. I want to take us on a little side trip here on a train. I forgot about this part. When he first is in practice there, in dental practice in Las Vegas, he also gets arrested for gambling in Old Town Las Vegas. They had gambling rules there, which is probably why the rough part went on to the other side across the river. And he leaves from there and goes back up to the town of Otero, which is one of the railroad stops coming down. And from there, he goes back up to Dodge City, where he takes part in the railroad wars in Colorado.
Yeah, that's an important. But one of the people that he met while he was in Dodge City, who apparently had a good reputation in Dodge City, it was in no trouble that we know of, whose name was John Joshua Webb, and and so they apparently became friends, and it's interesting. Two quick notes that this I mentioned this because of the suggestion that Doc Holliday, that Wyatt Earp was the only friend Doc Holliday had.
Just not true.
Because but he and Webb apparently hit it off, and Masterson, Kate says, and I find this fascinating, Kate says that when they left Dodge City, this would have been in the fall of 1878, that Bat Masterson gave Doc a 4.5-inch barrel. I think it was or short barrel. I think she puts it. Colt revolver, nickel-plated Colt revolver. Now we know that Bat ordered at least 5 such revolvers in his
Because we have it
life.
in the records of the Colts Manufacturing Company.
Well, but here's the deal. We know where they know where 3 of them are, and Colts will not give you the number of an unidentified weapon. In other words, if you say, what are the numbers on the 2 that you haven't located? They say, we're not going to give them to you, because anybody can take a Colt revolver and put a serial number on the barrel.
Right, so then they could
So that they,
make a
so there are 2.
fraudulent
I think there are 2 pistols that are unaccounted for that Bat ordered, but they were all. He liked that about a 4.5-inch barrel, short barrel.
And so why would Bat Masterson have given Doc Holliday a gun?
Well, they had become. I think they had become. Despite what he later says, I never liked him. That kind of stuff that he says later on, or that sometimes I've suspected that that's what Alfred Henry Lewis said about him, rather than because there are all sorts of articles that Bat Masterson interviews and so forth in the newspapers in the 1880s, where he keeps you. That's how we found out that he was in a place where we never looked before.
And Bat was concerned about his health.
And he was concerned about his health.
Yeah,
So
no, I think that Bat always acts like a friend to Doc Holliday, and the fact that he gives him a gun, the only other way you could explain that is, well, Bat was such a good friend to Wyatt, and Holliday had saved Wyatt's life. He's giving it to Doc as a thank you gift for saving Wyatt. That's a lot of expense to give to somebody.
But there's also the fact that I think that essentially Bat used Doc as more than just another gun on the in the Royal Gorge.
And that's what we
affair.
need to mention here, what the Royal Gorge War was. This was a battle between the Santa Fe Railroad and the Durango, or the Rio Grande.
Denver and Rio
Thank
Grande.
you. I wrote a whole book about trains. It's a battle between the Denver and Rio Grande and the Santa Fe over the right-of-way through the Royal Gorge of the Colorado River. And the Royal Gorge was crucial because it was too narrow for two sets of railroad tracks. In fact, in one place it's so narrow that the tracks are actually hanging above the river because there's only room for the river. And they had to have that access because it's the access that went up to the mining country and especially to Leadville. So two railroads were fighting over this, and Dodge City considered the Santa Fe their own hometown railroad. And so Bat Masterson, who was working for the Santa Fe, they'd hired him, he calls in all of his, he said 100 gunfighter friends to help back him up in this battle for the Royal Gorge.
Well, I think that Doc also did some recruiting for him.
Mm-hmm. I believe so. In Dodge City.
In Dodge.
Well,
not just in Dodge City, but that's quite probably in New Mexico as well.
Well, and that's a part of a story we get from Eddie Foy, comedian Eddie Foy there in Dodge City, that Doc tried to recruit him.
Yeah.
You remember that funny thing that Eddie said about that? I couldn't hit the side of a barn. I'm not a good shot. And Doc said, well, you can use a shotgun.
Yeah. So it's but when they finally have the big showdown
there in Pueblo.
Mm-hmm. It could have been a really bloody affair, but Masterson had basically decided that I think he had gotten wind from the Santa Fe that it was kind of pointless.
Well, because it was going through the courts. The courts were going to decide.
One of the interesting things is that at one point the Denver and Rio Grande, they had a what today would be a National Guard thing in Pueblo, and they had a cannon there.
Right.
And so they told them to get that cannon, but by the time they got there to get it, Masterson already had it. He had confiscated it for the Santa Fe Railroad.
Well, and for those who don't know, they weren't actually having a war. They were both guarding the tracks while the courts came to their decision about who would own the right.
But there did come at the roundhouse. There did come into a brawl.
It came to a battle.
And one of the interesting things about the battle is that when it was over and everybody went back to Dodge City, one of the people who'd been injured in the brawl was John Joshua Webb.
Who was Doc's friend, who was an owner of the Lady Gay Saloon.
Lady Gay Saloon. And he was sporting a new tooth. He had a tooth knocked out, and where would he have found a dentist? On the train back to Dodge City.
His good friend, Doc Holliday.
Doc Holliday.
Yeah, so one of the fun stories that tells us that he wasn't just following Wyatt Earp around, he had his own life, he had his own associates, and the Doc felt like he was very engaged in the things that were going on, defending what needed to be defended. We start to see elements of this becoming a more noble character, I think, at this point in his life.
If I were rewriting the book today or doing a second edition, I would do some probably fairly extensive rewrites on the time between when Doc left Dodge City and through the Las Vegas portion of his career there, because they're just I've looked at it in more detail, and there are a couple of things that stand out. One of is the fact that Doc moved around a good bit. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a possibility that he went back to Dodge City yet again, and that was the time when he missed Wyatt Earp. They crossed paths.
Right.
That Wyatt was going to Las Vegas, and Doc was
going the other way.
Going the other way. And then they caught up and they turned around and they ended up meeting in Las Vegas.
Well, and two, Doc going to Dodge, we know he practiced in Dodge, we know he practiced in Las Vegas, we know he practiced in the town of Otero, New Mexico also. because he was in business with a Dr. Fageley who was there, and that showed up in the papers. So Doc Holliday, this is the Santa Fe Trail. Dodge City, Otero, Las Vegas. There are some records about him being in business in Albuquerque. This is Santa Fe Trail stuff. So he's kind of setting up Doc Holliday's dental clinics along this trail. So it looks like he's really trying to finally be that professional man he set out to be.
But I think there's also something else that comes into play here, because I think that that after he got into Las Vegas and set up his saloon and
called, as far as we know, Doc Holliday's Saloon. Didn't have a name.
And it turned out that Jordan Webb, his partner, was John Joshua's Webb's brother. So and Joshua doesn't really settle down in Las Vegas until after the Royal Gorge business.
Right.
And then there's a whole thing about Hoodoo Brown and the gangs there, but there's another thing that isn't emphasized all that much, is that there's no mention of Kate in Otero.
Right.
He's living with Fageley and Washington.
Right.
And Washington gets lynched for raping a woman.
Fine man.
I don't know whether it was a rape or an assault or whatever, but anyway, it was treated as a rape, and they hanged him.
But the point being, Kate wasn't there, and Kate
was not there.
Let's talk about Las Vegas. Let's talk about the saloon in Las Vegas, and we need to talk about the shooting that happened there. But there's an interesting document relating to his saloon. At one point, he buys another 8 feet of property right next to his saloon, which could have been for, it's big enough to put a little bit of your dental office in.
Yeah.
It's small enough to have been a back access. It could have been just an extension on his little saloon. But on the document, there's a codicil to that deed where the judge says that he asked Holliday, "Are you sure you want this woman's name to your said wife?" And he doesn't say what her name is, because Holliday wants the saloon, or that piece of property, to be in her name also, and said wife. And the judge says, I explained to him that it's not necessary for this woman's name to be on the deed, but basically he insisted, and he gives the initials. Is it A? It's ABF, I think, and it's not Mary Catherine Haronia. It's not Kate Elder. It's none of those names. There's no. You look at those initials and you cannot permutate them any way to come up with it being Kate Elder. So who's this woman? Was he putting up a madam in a little place next to his spot? We have no idea who that woman is. So the mystery woman of Las Vegas.
The thing too is that you remember that the editor of the of the Las Vegas Optic,
yes,
later. After the troubles began that were going on in Tombstone, wrote an article in which he called the doc a bagged, I can't remember the expression that he used, but he put a pretty sorry put down, and said that.
And the woman, he didn't say the name, but he said, and the woman, a Santa Fe tidbit.
A Santa Fe tidbit.
Yeah.
And
maybe not Kate.
It's maybe not Kate, but I suspect I'm inclined to believe that Doc and Kate had a kind of volatile election or a relationship. I think.
Right.
And I think there were times when they would get in fights and they would go their separate ways.
Yeah, I think she stormed in and out of his life quite a bit.
Yeah, and so she would go, and she could very well have gone to New Orleans. We mean to
Santa Fe.
To Santa Fe.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about the other thing that happened, and we're being accosted by a fly here. Are you saying this?
Indeed.
I hope our viewers don't get It's just part of the Wild West theme we've got going on.
You can't be in the cattle and
exactly.
and the horse country without
here we are
without flies. That's for sure.
Okay, so Doc's in Las Vegas. He's got a saloon. He's evidently got a girl working there in a saloon who's not Kate, serving drinks, something or other, and she's got a boyfriend, and his name is Mike Gordon.
Yes.
And he's a little drunk. What happens with Mike?
Mike Gordon is an interesting character.
Isn't
He
he?
goes back into Texas. He was a scout for the Army. Seemed pleasant enough when he was sober, and turned into a real jerk when he got drunk. And they were celebrating the arrival of the railroad.
Which had been working its way down.
Been working
right.
its way down. And Otero, for example, just about lock, stock, and barrel moved.
They did. It was an end-of-track town, and they just packed up and moved to Las Vegas.
Moved to Las Vegas.
Yeah.
But, and they were having a big party at one of the establishments close to the depot. And apparently, this girl that worked in Doc's saloon was working that night, and Mike Gordon came in and basically said, "We need to go to the party down at
Wants her to come off with him. Sure.
and wants her to go with him, and she won't. I mean, she doesn't go. So he leaves the place drunk, and then there are some few little details that are mixed, but Gordon approaches the saloon again and begins to shoot into the saloon
From out in the street.
from out in the street.
And it's likely that this saloon of Holliday's at the time was a tent saloon, and a lot of the things right there on Railroad Street had not yet been built up all the way. So even easier to shoot in and hit somebody in your saloon when it's because shortly thereafter he signs a contract to have more building done on his saloon. So anyway, Mike Gordon fires into the saloon.
And the generally accepted account is that Doc Holliday went out to the sidewalk, and he was fired at again, and he shot and hit, and then he just went back in the saloon. He didn't play, and Gordon
had
walked
hit one of his customers. He hit one of Doc's customers in the leg in the
In the
saloon. So
leg,
Doc's
yeah.
got to now defend his saloon.
So he goes, anyway, Gordon's out there on the street, and he walks for a distance, because when he's found, he's some distance away from the
In like
from
a
the
gutter.
saloon. And that's,
And he's died. He's bled to death of a
He's
gunshot
dead.
wound to the arm or something. And they said if he'd gone to get help, he might have lived, but
Yeah,
he was
but,
drunk.
but he was gone.
And no legal action came against Holliday because of this. Likely because, as the same thing with Charlie Austin in Dallas, Holliday's the police in his saloon. If somebody shoots into your saloon, you're supposed to police the place. But he doesn't stick around real long after that. He's got some legal things he's taken care of. He's got property issues. He owes money for people who've built onto his saloon. He's got some things to finish up with that. But that person comes back into town again.
Yes. Well, there's Wyatt, and they run into each other.
And where's Wyatt going? He's with his whole family.
Wyatt has decided to leave Dodge City. It seems like Dodge City's, it's another one of those periods where it's calmed down, and Wyatt's
Had lost its
and
snap, he said.
his brothers are considering getting together. You know, they've been scattered. James in Fort Worth, and Virgil somewhere else, and Morgan in Montana, and so Wyatt decides, actually Virgil had already moved to Prescott, and he
Which
was
is in Arizona,
Prescott,
northern Arizona.
Prescott,
It's a
Arizona,
territorial capital.
territorial capital, and so he comes through, and he meets up with Doc, and they talk, and
weren't Wyatt and his family, weren't they were in a wagon train,
They were in a
and they were
wagon.
camped on the green there in Old Town,
yeah.
on the plaza in Old Town, which at the time had a hangman's noose in the middle of it, which was interesting sight.
Yeah, it was on a windmill.
Yeah. And so Wyatt's family's all in their wagon, and he convinces Doc to go along. Now, Kate says she went along, and that she had to somebody insisted on having a sewing machine in the back. So maybe one of
Oh, that's part of the story that
Allie Earp told.
Allie Earp told. But the journey was not an easy trip from Las Vegas to
Or to Prescott in Arizona.
to Prescott. It was a pretty long distance and over difficult roads.
And desert.
But but they made it to Prescott and had a family reunion, and Kate was apparently with him, and stayed with him for a while. And when Wyatt, she got irritated with him over. She didn't like Wyatt Earp.
She never liked Wyatt Earp.
She never liked Wyatt Earp. I think there's a story there we haven't heard.
I think there's a story there, since we believe that Kate at one time worked in James Earp's bordello, Bessie Earp's bordello, and maybe Wyatt, there was some relationship there. She always hated him. So Wyatt and some of the family go on down to Tombstone.
Well, they pick up James and Wyatt,
and they get Virgil,
and they pick up Virgil.
Right, and they but Doc doesn't go with them.
This is where Virgil, where the story is told of the sewing machine.
Is there. Well, and this is the beginning of the movie Tombstone. So when they're headed down to Tombstone. Yeah. But Doc doesn't go with them down to Tombstone.
No, he doesn't go with them. He keeps an independent flair. But they have an argument over it. And he and Kate. And Kate decides to leave, and she's going, I think, to Globe or somewhere.
Right, which was another mining town.
Another mining town. But Doc still doesn't go. He goes back to Las Vegas.
Because he has business to take care of.
And this is interesting about his character, too. Mm-hmm. He's got outstanding business with a carpenter.
For having helped build onto the saloon.
For the additions to the saloon. And he goes back to settle those accounts. And while that's happening, there's there's more trouble. The Hoodoo Brown thing comes to an end. And in the course of the action, John Joshua Webb shoots and kills a man, and he is arrested, although he was a policeman in Dodge and in Las Vegas. And he is tried for murder.
And ends up in prison there.
And he was sentenced to, during the time of the trial, is when of Webb, is when Doc came back, and he is. And
this is a friend of his now, who's in jail, who's in prison.
And he was in jail, and it's likely that he attended the trial because he was there at the time, taking care of business.
And aside to that, on with the rest of that story, Webb finally escapes, and who does he get out of jail with?
Yeah, he finally he escaped. It is impossible for me to. They talk about a hole that's about 9 inches through the wall, and I can't imagine John Joshua Webb as big as he was.
And he escapes with Dave Rudabaugh, right?
Dave Rudabaugh.
Yeah, and he must have thought that was the worst decision he ever made, because that kind of wrecks his life, running with Rudabaugh.
But there were two incidents involving attempts to it. There was an attempt to escape, in which Rudabaugh was involved in that, or this I think was before he was arrested, but that Rudabaugh, they basically took a gun and some clothing or something and threw it into the jail cell of where Webb was, and in the process they killed a guard that was at a jail guard.
And happily, Doc is no longer with these people. He's trying to make a new life.
He's in Prescott at that time. But
so he comes back and he settles these debts that he's got, takes care of his legal stuff, which is really fascinating, because if you look through his life, all the times he's arrested or had legal things, he follows every case through. He never, well, except one time, and we're going to get to that, he skips a state to get away from a charge, and we'll go there. But so he settles there, and he goes back to Prescott, and the census comes through, and he signs the census record, John H. Holliday, DDS. So he's still considering himself a dentist. I mean, even though he's a gambler, his profession, his identity is dentistry. And, you know, that is an identity. Having been able to be smart enough to get to dental school and then graduate well enough to be taken in as a partner briefly with the president of the Georgia Dental Association, that's a big deal. He was proud of that.
You'll notice too in that when the census taker came, that there's no Kate.
Nope. And he lists himself as.
And he's in a
And he
boarding
calls
house.
himself single.
He lists himself as single, and they're living in a boarding house. And one of the people that he's sharing the boarding house with is John J. Gosper.
Which is the next interesting part of this story that's going to take us to Tombstone.